Thank you. Sober today, but happy birthday to all the birthday people. Welcome to our visitors. Glad you're all here today. You're a treat, I think. Anyhow, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce my friend Dave. I've known him for well over. We used to hang out at the old KC Hall, years ago. And I'll do it.
There's lots of room.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to Montana. Anyhow, like I said, I've known Dave forever, we've become years. Wasn't that way at first, but took a while. He's kind of hard to get used to. But anyhow, there's a saying, if you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get, ready to take some steps. Well, with Dave, there's a lot of people we come around, we meet a lot of people, but we never know much. I got to say a couple of good things about Dave. He's a race car driver, extraordinary. I mean, he's been to the Nationals. Thing there was to win around here. And the only advice I can give you is if you ever ride with him in his race car, wear a diaper. He's something else. Yeah, he's something else. And he's a master carpenter too, I mean, he just replaced all the windows in my house. And our friend Greg, and that was quite a job, but he did it, and he's a real perfectionist, I mean, the trim they put on the inside windows, he got all the rough lumber, he planed it, and sanded it off, and we verithined it, and it's just absolutely beautiful. When he was making his cuts, for the frame, one cut he had was maybe a quarter of an inch off, for the frame. And I said, let's stick her in there, Dave. I said, nobody's ever going to see it, and then nobody's going to know anyhow. It won't show. He says, I'll know. And that really showed me something, to thine own self be true. He wants to do the next right indicated thing. And as far as I know, Dave, he always does, He's a great guy. And he helps out the kids in the high school, with the automotive classes and stuff, He does all kinds of stuff, And he's extremely intelligent. We have coffee all the time, but I shouldn't say all these good things because I'm going to do it. He's really intelligent, and Scott and I and him and my son Michael have coffee all the time, and those guys have such a vast knowledge, array of knowledge. Just amazing to sit there and listen to him. And Dave, he used to have a good friend that passed away, Dick F. He was a professor at the university, chemistry professor, and he told me to him, he said, this program isn't rocket science. He said, but I'm actually a rocket scientist. He said, and he was too, Amazing. But Dave was the only guy around that could have a conversation with him. Hell, nobody could. They'd lose you, but Dave could stay with him. The guy really knows what he's talking about, I'll tell you. But anyhow, he's been a little controversial too over the years, he loves Alcoholics Anonymous, and he loves the people in it, and he wants to keep things on track. And that's a good thing for old timers to do that, and I love the old timers when they speak up. Sometimes he doesn't have the best tact, and his delivery's off a little bit, but if you think about it for a while, he's usually right on 99% of the time, He just loves the program, and he doesn't want to see anything happen to it, He's lived it. He lives this thing, He sponsors so many people, and every time somebody, goes back out or whatever happens, it takes a piece of his heart. I've seen him get so emotional over losing a sponsee, it's just, I worry about it sometimes. He gets so, but he's really into this program. He's a great friend. I love him to pieces. When I was sick, he was at the hospital every day. Him and another buddy of mine were there every day to see me, and then he'd come up he'd come up to the house, he built me a handicap ramp and all that kind of stuff, and he's always been there for me, and if I needed anybody, Dave would be the guy, you know. And if you're new today, listen up, because this guy knows more about the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12-step book than anybody I know. So listen up, you're in for a treat. Dave, if, like my friend Terry always says, you know, if nobody has told you today that they love you, I do, man.
Well, I'm Dave, and I'm an alcoholic. And I just want to qualify my remarks as Alcoholics Anonymous saved my life. Okay. And I love this program. The only thing I've done right is not drink. You know, of course, the only way I've ever learned anything is by making a mistake in the first place. So, I'll, last time I tried speaking here, I froze up for some reason. I couldn't speak. It was really weird because I love to talk. And I'll just go give you a brief bio. I was born in Michigan, and my family moved west to Green River, Wyoming in 1951. And it was a little town. There was less than 3,000 people there in the high desert. And it was quite an experience. I remember riding out on a steam locomotive powered passenger train. So it's been a while. Some of us remember things like that, you know, old. So my mother was ill most of the time when I was a kid, and not emotionally available. And you know, I think that contributed to me being insecure in my person, and I always felt that way. I can remember when I was 3 years old, before we moved, I get up before everybody in the house and go sit in front of a heat register and to stay warm and feel comfortable. So a furnace was my mother, so to speak. Um, so my dad was a chemical engineer, and both my mother and father attended the University of Michigan, graduated from there. Um, my grandfather taught engineering at Michigan. So anyway, uh, I I didn't drink a lot uh, early. Well, like not in high school. You know, a few times I got drunk, a couple of times. Went to college. I didn't drink in college very much. I like hashish and LSD. You know, and so you know, psychedelics were probably my favorite drug. Although I did everything under the sun that I could get my hands on. So I graduated here out at the University of Montana in history and secondary education. I never taught, never did my practicum. But anyway, I after graduating, I with a partner, uh, Penny Hayes, we started a restaurant business in Missoula on Woody Street called High Mountain Cafe. It was a natural foods cafe. And we bought 50 acres of land, a south-facing gulch in the Jocko Valley. And I bought an old reservation homestead log house for $150 and 3 tires. Seriously. and I moved it piece by piece, onto the land. And those were good years as far as health goes. Hard work. We had a huge garden. Um, we had to haul water because we didn't have water system. We had no electricity. Uh, wood stoves, wood cooked stove, everything. It's kind of like homestead, only a century later from when people really did it. So anyway, um, our relationship was mostly, we worked really well together. I call her my first wife, although we never married. With the land we had was a joint tenants in common agreement, and and neither of us knew very much about what we were doing. And finally, when it came down to emotional and spiritual and other matters, um, we weren't very compatible. So, but that was after we had a son. The whole thing was, was a dream I always had, to live in the mountains and have in a beautiful cabin and have a life, a child, family. So it was pretty devastating to me because I didn't know what the fuck was going on either, you know. And that's when my drinking really, really got going. Um, the self pity, the sense of loss, and all the things that we alcoholics indulge ourselves in. I can say, well, she did, she, it, her, him, whatever we can point to without having to point to ourselves. And I was not aware that I was an alcoholic. Started out in that period. I used to play 12-string acoustical guitar, and I had a fiddle player played with me, and I'd drink half a pint of whiskey before we practiced. Yeah, might be an alcoholic. So, and then it just progressed, and everything went downhill. So we divorced, and it took me another 10 years to drink myself to the bottom. And I call myself a serial monogamist. I lived with several different women during my drinking period, and I always when the breakup happened, I always thought, well, the next one won't be. I'll make sure she's not like that. You know, I never looked at myself and was like, maybe I have the problem. And so what happened was that I came to one morning, and this is after the gal who dumped me, who I was in love with, and I've commented before that I was in love with the idea of her, being alcoholic would do stuff like that instead of, relate heart to heart to the real person. And anyway, it hurt quite a bit, and I ended up one morning, and the best description I have of that day was comes from a song by Rory Block. If anybody's ever heard of her, she's a blues guitarist and singer. She wrote a song called Love and Whiskey. And in that song, she says, and in the morning light, your life is scattered with the wind. And in the morning light, my life was scattered with the wind. And I had that moment of clarity, we have, and I looked around and my little basement apartment, it was just trashed. I'd gone from having artwork on the walls and living plants and, playing music and doing all sorts of things to the bottom. There was nothing left there really. And I knew the clarity came to me if I tried doing the same thing again, maybe stay sober for a week, get another job, right, another girlfriend, I looked at that and I said, it's going to kill you. you're done. You can't do that. It's not a solution anymore. And so what I did was there were pipes running through my basement apartment. I was in a little apartment house over there by the green hangar. And so I contemplated going out to my little truck and getting a rope out and finishing the deal. Because I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know there were treatment centers, when I got sober. I guess they had fired one up at St. Pat's a few years before. So I what I did was I remembered they had AA meetings at the Knights of Columbus Hall, and I'd been to a noon meeting there once to give support to a friend who got his third DUI, right? Before I went to that meeting with him, I had 3 shots of brandy and a couple of beer backs, So I don't remember much of the meeting. I was just there to support my friend, right? But the point is, I knew what a meeting was. And so I walked across town because the starter was broken on my pickup. I had a 69 Datsun pickup. And I went to my first meeting. It was the High Noon Group of Alcoholics Anonymous. So 2 things happened, a bunch of stuff happened, but I was a mess. I go from laughing to crying to, all kinds of crap. I was broken open in a sense, which is a comment that my friend Dick Field, who Frank talked about, the chemistry professor, was talking with a retired priest friend of his, and he was telling him his experience of a spiritual awakening and learning not to drink. And the priest said, he says, well, you people have been broken open. And that's what happened. I got broke open. So that day, I figured if I didn't get help at that meeting, then I'd just go home and hang myself. And there was a guy there, Michael C., who's still with us. Some of you probably know him, Michael Cochran. And he was the worst drunk I ever knew. I mean, it's no shit. Got a call one night at the bar, and this is like 1971, 72, and his girlfriend had tried committing suicide and slashed her wrist and was in a bathtub, and we raced over there, and Michael was so drunk he couldn't do anything, and rushed to the hospital, saved her life. And next time, he's crawling up Front Street, all beat to shit. I mean, it's totally, he's hammered and literally crawling. And at the Old Top Hat bar, the pool table was next to the window. You look out on the sidewalk, here comes Michael, right? So anyway, he was at that meeting, and he had 8 years of sobriety, and he was dressed well. His eyes were clear. He just graduated from college, was married, and had a baby on the way. And that blew my mind. And it gave me hope. And so anyway, the other thing that happened, I had the good fortune of, after the meeting with Dave Wicks, who we called Alaska Dave. And he he knew the book inside out and backwards, and very articulate, very intelligent man. And we sat in the back room with the Knights of Columbus, and he 12-stepped. And anyway, I had step 1 down. I knew I was an alcoholic way before I got to AA. So anyway, we're reading the steps, and I said, I don't know about this God stuff, And he says, well, Dave, he says, being the condition you are in, so do you ever just cry out and say, God help me? Yep. I mean, I was, we often do stuff like that when we're desperate. And I agreed. I said, yeah. And he says, well, maybe that shows the willingness toward there is a higher power and whatever you want to call it. And of course, the bar on step 3 is pretty low. So was for me when, to God of my understanding. So anyway, he says, well, look, you don't have to have a God of your understanding. All you need for these steps 2 or 3, a willingness to believe that be restored to sanity, willingness to make a decision. And okay, I can do that. So what happened was that when I got I stayed sober 2.5 months and went to meetings, but I made a huge mistake. And that was, I thought I could do it myself because I'm so fucking smart and I've been to college and got a degree and all that stuff, and and so I drank February of 87. So my sobriety date, which I started in November in 86, and then sobriety date is Washington's birthday. Anybody know when Washington's birthday is? No, that's Lincoln. 22nd, that's that's one of those things old people know because now it's President's Day, right? Lincoln the 12th and Washington the 22nd. So anyway, I got sober, I came back, I got a sponsor. Tom Peel was his name. And I liked I wanted what Tom had. He had a 4-wheel drive, a hot rod, a house, and a 19-year-old girlfriend. And, part of that's funny and part of it's true, actually. So anyway, Tom got me through the steps. And that's the important thing. And I did step 4. And step 4 enlightened me to why 2 and 3 were so important. Because I found in my inventory that self-reliance had failed me. And and selfishness and self-centeredness was the root of my problem. And it says on 62. And so I went back to step 3. I could do a step 3 then. I could say, okay, I'm willing because I made a fucking mess out of my life because of me, not because of anybody else's fault, but anybody else, just me. So that's where I started. And it was the most enlightening thing I've ever done, is do a thorough step 4. So anyway, I go on and I'll tell a few stories here. Anyway, so a couple of things that happened when I got sober. I was out doing my 4th step and I had a picnic table in the yard where I lived in that little apartment. And I was riding away and I had 1 nickel, 1 package of Top Ramen and no job. And the rent was due. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, write this down. It's important. And then all of a sudden it just all caved in on me. And I said, oh shit, what am I going to do? And I actually bowed my head and I said, God, if your will for me is to sleep under a bridge and eat the pub, I will do it, but I will not drink. I made a commitment not to drink. And the next day I got a call on the payphone across the street where I was, because I didn't have a phone. And I used that for job searchers. And the guy says, yeah, he says, I need a carpenter. I went to work at noon. He says, he knows, he says, you didn't bring a lunch. Well, didn't have any money to buy lunch, right? And anyway, a little bit later, he comes back and he has me a check for $500. And he says, I need a guy like you that knows his stuff to work for me. And his name was Eric Johnson, one of the most generous people I've ever known in my life. The guy was amazing. And so I went to work for Eric I bought food, I paid the rent, and I went to meetings. Still, meetings are really a large part of my sobriety. So that was, you know, I call that commitment. It's sort of a miracle too, In this program, I want to say that, there's a book called The Road Less Traveled. Some of you may have read it, but in that book, he says Alcoholics Anonymous is the biggest, most amazing spiritual development of the 20th century. It's a pretty big statement. I believe that. I really do. So, some of the things I went through early in my sobriety, I had buckets of pay up deadbeat notices from collection companies when I got sober. And so, I was freaked out about it. He says, "Have you had a drink today?" I said, "No." He says, "Then you're doing all right." And I'll never forget that. So what I did is I went around the people, my creditors, and I started sending postal money orders to the hospital, to the doctor, to whatever, every month. Like 5 or 6 of them a month. And by the time they got me in front of a judge to get a judgment, I had a stack of them like this. And when my case came up, I put it on the judge's desk. And I said, "These people aren't working in good faith. Here's proof that I've been paying them, And he kind of flipped through them like a deck of cards. He says, "Well, you go out in the hall and work it out with their lawyer." So I go out there. The lawyer says, "Dave, what do you want to do?" And I said, "You know me?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "I went and ate lunch in your restaurant every day when I went to law school." I couldn't, I didn't remember it, He says, "What do you want to do here?" So later I found out the judge was one of us. And he could see me coming from a mile away. I mean, it was pretty easy, And but that's one of those things that has happened in my sobriety. Like another thing happened that when Melinda and I got married, I got a call, and this is so-and-so from Capital Credit Corporation. Your student loan is a delinquent 19 years. And I said to this guy, I said, "Yeah," I said, "I'm aware of that. It's on my list of events." And it was. So anyway, he said, there's a big pause. He said, "Oh yeah," he said, "Are you a friend of Bill's?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I got 18 months, he says. This is true. So he said, "What do you want to do here?" And I said, "Well, how long will it take me to pay this off for $50 a month?" And he does his calculation. He comes back, he says, 129 years. Oh my God. So, anyway, we made an agreement, and I did 2 monthly payments. I was working to make pretty good money, and that went away. But these are the things that happen when you get sober and stay sober and try. The process just says we try to carry the message, and try to practice these principles. Nothing like perfection, but that's all I've ever done is try. And so, some other things that happened. My dad. Well, first of all, I guess I'll talk about my marriage to Linda. And I met her at an AA function in Bonner Park playing volleyball, and her eyes were attracted to me. That's a lie. Yeah, I'm an animal looking. So anyway, I dated, but and both of us were done with relationships with no commitments and drinking and all the other stuff. So we weren't up to having a casual or anything. And so what happened was that eventually, after getting to know each other and taking walks and sharing reading and music and a bunch of other stuff that we like to do, I asked her to marry me. And she had a 1.5 year sobriety, and I had 2.5 years. Huge risk, you know. But my experience in life is that no risk, no gain. I mean, you just got to put it out there one time or another, or lots of times or whatever. And our first year, we both lost our jobs. We had 2 kids to raise. Linda got ill with both types of pneumonia at the same time, and I got in an emergency room, and the doc comes over and he says that her blood oxygen was so low that he thought she was having a pulmonary embolism. And he says they're 97% fatal. And so it didn't happen. She didn't die, obviously. Here she is. But that's one of the things that happened. You know, it just goes on, and we made it through all this stuff. There was one point where I thought to myself, and this is the first thought, second thought thing. I said, you know, I don't need this. You know, I could pack it up and leave. And then the next thought was, you stood up in front of 50 or 60 AA brothers and made a commitment, and you're going to goddamn stick to it. And unlike my alcoholism, which I never stopped, thank you, but any commitments like that, you know, I'm glad I did. So Linda got better. I went into business for myself. I was a remodeling contractor, and this is in the fall of '89. In the early summer of '90, believe it or not, we bought a house. And we could, I mean, it goes from absolute darkness to having our own home, you know, and a lot of, some of that was dependent, you know, how they check your credit and all that kind of stuff. Well, you know, I'd taken care of that as part of my amends. And Linda had pretty good credit. I didn't, but it was enough. So anyway, we'll be married 36 years this summer, and sober, married sober and stayed sober. And because of Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, I can't give AA enough credit, really. It's just absolutely amazing program. Now, so just a couple of stories. So we were married a few years. My dad came to visit, and he was very successful in his career. He on 2 boards of directors of chemical companies and stuff like that. And he says, well, you blew your chance to be successful. And Clint Grimes was there visiting at the same time. So you remember Clinton. And Clint said, made a comment, something like, well, you know, Dave thinks a lot. I don't know why I put that in, but Clint was a very dear friend of mine who passed here a couple of years ago. But anyway, I told my dad, I said, you know what? I said, I don't measure success like that. You know, because I was expected to be a doctor or a lawyer, stockbroker, whatever the hell. And I said, my measure of success is if I can help one single alcoholic get away from and come to recovery and get away from the misery of alcoholism, if I can help them in any way I can and it does any good, that's success. So the next day, we went to a meeting downtown at the Union place down there, Union Hall, and a guy that sponsored an AA, Mike Pernington, actually, was celebrating 5 years and he was speaking. So he spoke and at the end of the deal, if I tear up, it's just the way it is. My dad stepped out of the circle when we were holding hands to say the Lord's Prayer, and he said, "Can I say something?" And he's an old guy, so nobody's going to say, "No, you can't." He said, "Thanks for saving my son's life." Wow, huh? And you know, when my sister got married, I had 4.5 months of sobriety. There was a big circle, was down in Santa Cruz, and they gave everybody a glass of champagne, right? And then you toast the bride and groom. And they gave one to me, and before the toast, I surreptitiously poured the champagne out and pretended to toast. And my dad was watching. He says, it was then he said, "Oh, you take this seriously, the sobriety stuff?" I said, "Yeah." You know, but that's just a little story. So, you know, when I was first in a few months, I got the message that my dad was not sleeping at night and praying for me because he thought I was going to die. And he had good reason for the I was going to die with my condition. So I called him and I said, I joined Alcoholics Anonymous, and I fully intended to never take another fucking drink as long as I lived. And I just wanted to know that. That's sort of like making amends out of order in the steps, you know. But I needed to do that to give him some peace, you know, because I realized, you know, I have a son, and a lot of that stuff, you know, I realized what it means to be a father and how much you love and care for your children and want them to do well. And so anyway, that's one of the things that happened. When I got to so the 4th step, 5th step, 6 and 7, I didn't know very much about, not near as much as I know now. But I did what the book said, you know. I did the 5th step, went home, contemplated 6 and 7, and and I did my amends. And one of the biggest resentments I had was my brother. You know, I've been estranged from him for 20 years. He had borrowed the Model 70 30-06, my 1949 model that I used for hunting, and moved to Louisiana and traded for a pair of water skis. And boy, you know, I mean, I could drive nails and that thing, you know. I was the hunter in our family in Wyoming. So anyway, that, and then I came burning through with my very wealthy heiress girlfriend from Houston. I was doing a restoration of a Bay House down there, and we're driving a Mercedes Roadster going to New Orleans to listen to music and boogie. So I stopped by, and his business was going in the toilet. He had a computerized lathe company to make oil tools. This is in the early 80s when the oil patch went down. You know, you got stuck with a lot of debt. And anyway, so he had the 22 little Remington Hamlin's pump rifle, 30-inch barrel, octagonal, that I hunted rabbits with in possession. I said, well, why don't you give it to me? And when I get back to Montana, I'll teach Jamie how to shoot, my son. And he looked at me, he said, what are you gonna keep it? The box you live out of? And of course, my pride was mortally wounded, but he was absolutely right. I mean, so anyway, when I got to making amends, I had to ask myself the question of, with this resentment, was there anything I really did to show my brother that I loved and cared for him and inquired after his family and his 3 children or what was going on in his life? Absolutely not. Nothing. But I expected all this stuff. I expected him to love me and treat me like a little brother, and share with me the things that big brothers do, right? That's sort of the deal. And I did absolutely nothing to earn that or do that. And I realized that I expected him to do all this stuff. I didn't do jack shit, right? So I wrote him a letter and I told him that in my amends. And about a month or 2 later, I got a box with a rifle in it. And a letter that said, told me all about his family, what was going on, and that he loved it. Wow. Power. Now, I've had other wonderful amends experiences that were just absolutely amazing. Frank Walker, a family physician friend of ours, of my family, my sister, who I conned out of $50, I thought, because I ran out of money from drinking. He ran the ER out of the community. So anyway, I was working on a house across the street, big Victoria, 3-story. Every day I'd go up and work on the roof and had a picket iron fence around it, with little spear points on it. And every morning, I've told this story recently, I climbed that ladder. I did my 3rd step, which was, God, my ass is in your hands. Climbing up there, it was about 30 feet or so before you impale yourself if you fell. Anyway, caddy corner across the street was where Frank, the doc, lived. And every day I call up there, I tell myself, you owe him an amends. You need to do this. So one day I called down off the roof and I went over there and I made my amends, wrote out a check. He wasn't there, his wife was there. These are people who are really close to I took his family all on a hike one day up Squaw Peak. I don't know what the hell they call it now. But anyway, maybe it's Native American Breast Peak or something. I'm not sure, but there's a Salish name for it. And stuff like that. We shared a lot over in the 70s. So when Linda and I got married, he came, he showed up, and I talked to him and he says, I knew you were in trouble. He said, it's so good to see that you're sober and getting married, And those kind of things are what happened in Alcoholics Anonymous. So to me, particularly, but it's really cool stuff. And just to end it, what I have to say, I could go on and on. This is fun. But so one of those Bonner Park AA celebrations, I don't know which one it was, but I walked up to fully clothed Mary, we call her, and I says, I don't know about this God thing. How do I know that there's a God? She says, I'll tell you what to do. She said, every night when you go to bed, pray that God reveals himself to you. So what have I got to lose? Really? I mean, I've done this whole program with what do I got to lose? When I came up against things I didn't particularly want to do, and what I got to lose is my life, by the way. So every day for a couple of months every night. I pray, very simple as God revealed himself. And I had a dream. In this dream, I was walking down Jocko Road towards where we lived. I lived on the other side of the river, where the river comes out of the canyon. And all of a sudden I was enveloped by this pure, lucid light. Just whoa. And these two little kids walked out of it. And I said, where did you come from? And they said, it's not relevant. And when I took their hands and we walked across this field in front of the gulch, and when we got to the river, there was a white arch bridge, which doesn't exist, of course, it's just there. It went right into the mouth of the gulch. As we crossed that bridge, there was a restaurant in the middle of it, and the clatter of worldly things and dishes and conversation going on and all this stuff. And we came off the end and walked up the gulch, and my ex was having a soiree. She was playing the piano. Everybody was dressed in black, and I said, you wouldn't believe what happened. This light enveloped me, and these little kids came out of it. And I was still holding hands with these little kids. And they said, oh yeah, sure, Dave, you're the one that, drives down the ditch road at 50 miles an hour. I mean, my credibility was blown by my drinking in that neighborhood. But so anyway, I turned to him, I said, show them. And boom. Here came the light. And I woke up, I was sitting up, and tears streaming down my face. I'm going, what the fuck was that? And I said a little prayer, and I said, God, I don't know what this is, but I'll just do what I need to do. And the answer I got was, don't try to analyze it. Seriously. Because I'm really into analyzing stuff, and so I didn't try to analyze it, but after that dream, I felt like I was walking on a cushion of air for quite a while. Just like what it blew my mind. And finally, I looked at it and I realized what it was is it was a dream of going from the dark to the light. And in that period of my sobriety, of not drinking, going to meetings and having a sponsor and trying to take these steps, what happened was that I got the gift to see what was going on. It was darkness to light. And I suppose if I was really religious, I'd say, I'm born again or something. But it's not that way. The really wonderful thing about Alcoholics Anonymous is we can have our own spiritual experiences just by practicing these steps. Free to everybody. I don't have to have somebody tell me what to do, when to pray, what to believe. And wow, what a gift. Anyway, I didn't cover it all, but I wanted to read out of the book. I will read one thing if I may indulge you guys. On page 275 of the fourth edition, it's written by a woman who helped start AA in Chicago, and she was one of the founders, the first woman. But anyway, some keys of the kingdom. And we read this for Clinton Grimes' memorial when he died. His son read it. And his AA is not a plan for recovery. It can be finished and done with. It is a way of life, and the challenge contained in its principles is great enough to keep any human being striving for as long as he lives. We cannot outgrow this plan. As arrested alcoholics,
We must have a program for living that allows for limitless expansion. Keeping one foot in front of the other is essential for maintaining our arrestment. Others may idle in the retrogressive groove without too much danger. But retrogression can spell death for us. However, it isn't as rough as it sounds, as we do become grateful for the necessity. It makes us toe the line, and we find we are compensated for a consistent effort by the countless dividends we receive. That's it.
Thanks, Dave.